Hi everyone. We are here now in chapter 14, which is getting to a chapter where many of you probably had thought that we would have started talking about this kind of thing in the very beginning. And that is that we're going to talk about banks, money, and at least for the United States, the central bank in the United States called the Federal Reserve, or in more commonly known as the Fed. Um, okay, so when we think about modern economies really rely on this existence of money. So what we're going to see here is that we're going to spend the majority of our chapter here just talking about why money exists, how it's created, and what role banks play in that money creation system. And then the more recent invention, about 100 years ago, of a central bank in the United States, something that had been tried previously in the past and then finally took hold in 1914. Again, that would be our central bank in the United States, the Federal Reserve. So the chapter begins with something that just happened last year. In fact, I even made a special lecture about it last year when it was happening. So if anyone has any interest in that, extra special, that extra, comma, special lecture. I guess not extra special, it's just an extra. It's about a 20-minute video where I talk more extensively about this bank that failed on the West Coast in California, to the east of us. The bank that failed was called Silicon Valley Bank. And if we look at this, the idea is that, as we'll see in this chapter, is that banks make money by lending out money. So it's their job to lend out money. And in this case, Silicon Valley Bank had $200 billion in assets, $175 billion in deposits, and yet it failed. The question would be why did it fail? Usually what happens when a bank fails is that they've made loans that were bad loans, where the people aren't making their payments. So you could imagine, for instance, like during the 2008 crisis, when many of you were born, if a homeowner says, I'm not going to pay my bank back, then the bank could fail because they're not getting their mortgage payments from the people that borrowed money from them. In the case of Silicon Valley Bank, it failed for a very different reason. It failed because banks take in all these deposits from people. They make loans, but then what they don't make out in loans, they also hold as assets, and this would be this assets of $200 billion. Those assets, the value of it, why are we valuing those assets at $200 billion? Well, the biggest asset that banks are allowed to own, so banks can't own any asset they want. They have to buy U.S. government treasuries, other sorts of incredibly stable assets. So Silicon Valley Bank was taking in a lot of money in 2020, 2021, and they started buying lots of U.S. government debt. So, right, they were putting all their money into U.S. government debt at the time. And then the inflation started to happen in 2022 and 2023. And to try to reduce that inflation, the fact that prices were going up so much, the Federal Reserve, as many of you may have heard about, the Federal Reserve raised the interest rate, something that we're going to learn about much more in these following chapters. But as they raised the interest rate, it made the value of the bonds that this bank bought in 2020 and 2021 fall in value. Because, this is the interesting part, because those bonds that they bought in 2020 and 21 were paying a lower interest rate, then they were worth less. And so the bank did nothing wrong. There was no thievery or anything like that. It's just that they bought a lot of an asset that fell a lot in value when it most of the time shouldn't have. And so the bank failed because the asset that was backing everything went away in value. Interesting fact for those of you who are gamers and whatnot. One of the big bank account holders was Roblox. It was something like $600 million. They had a $600 million account, something like that. That's pretty big. That's a lot of Roblox. Robux, I guess. Okay. What's the point of this slide? I mean, one, if you understood the story I just told you, that's great. But even if you didn't understand everything I just said, it does highlight what the title of this slide says, which is the fragility of banking. Banking is quite complicated and fragile and depends on a lot of things that move around. Okay, so the first question we need to address here in this chapter is what is money? So really money is anything that people are willing to accept in exchange for goods and services or for the payment of debts. You know, the dollars that we have right now, right, that we own, they are not backed by gold or silver or anything like that. It's just really a piece of paper that on it says that the U.S. government pledges that, you know, this will be worth $1. But there's nothing backing it up. And again, the thing that gives it value is the fact that people are willing to accept it, right? I accept dollars for my pay because I know that when I need to pay my mortgage, they will only take dollars. My kids' tuition, the schools only take dollars. So I take dollars, right, when I want to get payment. So then we get this thing called Bitcoin, right, or any kind of cryptocurrency. And I sound like an old man shaking my cane at the sky when I have to tell people that, you know, that cryptocurrency is not money. You know, it's not. It's not. I mean, the reason why I say that it's not is because of the fact that I don't know very many merchants that are willing to accept crypto. Right? I mean, yeah, there's like, I think you can buy a Tesla with like Dogecoin, or you know, you can probably buy some like knockoff pharmaceuticals with, you know, some other, you know, crypto, or I don't know, illegal fireworks or illegal drugs, you know, all those kinds of things. But for like day-to-day things, no one's taking crypto. So it's really not money. I don't get paid in crypto. I don't know anyone that gets paid in crypto. You know, so why do people keep saying it's money? I mean, it's to me, as an economist, not as an investor, as an economist, it is not money. Now, I could buy it because I think that it's going to rise in value like an NFT would, or that it's going to rise in value like a piece of art would. But it's not money. So I don't know. I don't get to make the laws in this world. So, but if I could, I would say that crypto should not be called a currency or money in any way, shape, or form. So, what is this money doing, right? The money, again, is anything that people are willing to accept in exchange for goods or services or for the payment of debt. And if we didn't have it, we would have to barter, right? We would have to trade good for good, right? I don't know. You cut my hair, I teach you an economics lecture. But the problem with that is this double coincidence of wants, right? So let's say that you know how to cut hair. Well, I don't have a ton of hair left at this point in my life. So we're gonna have a problem where we don't have a double coincidence of wants. You're gonna be offering me a haircut and be like, dude, I don't have that much hair. And you'll be like, but yeah, I need an economics lecture. So barter became a really early, had problems from the very beginning. And so barter transitioned to what's called commodity money, which was that there were certain things that were seen as having some universal value. So they took those things that had some universal value and they made that the money. So the common one would be gold, right? You would have a coin that was actually made of gold or a coin that was actually made of silver. And that people would then accept the gold as payment or the silver as payment. And so you see this, well, let me put it to you this way. This is an absolutely true fact, what I'm about to say to you. From all that we know, the person that existed in the late 1500s, early 1600s, had exactly the same standard of living as someone born during the time of Jesus Christ. I say this as as a person who does always believe in the kind of the progress of society. It's pretty amazing to think that a millennium and a half, 1500 years, that there was no progress in the economy for 1500 years. And then things suddenly started to change in the Middle Ages. Now, we can't really say any causation, but there's certainly a great deal of correlation between then the emergence of commodity money and the beginnings of a developed economy. But then things really start to take off as societies move away from commodity money. And that would be when they turn to what we're going to know as fiat money, which we're going to see here in a few slides. So what does money have to do? It has to serve these four functions. The most important of these functions would be my medium of exchange. This is the most important. Money just has to be something that people are willing to accept as a form of payment. So again, I'm not saying that cryptocurrency can't become money. It's just that it isn't right now. And so if anything, maybe people are investing in it because they think that at some point people are going to be accepting it rather than the US dollar. There's other reasons why. I mean, I think this is a good example to go with. Why I think the dollar fulfills the function of a money, which I think it does, and why I don't think that, let's say, Bitcoin doesn't fulfill these conditions. Is the US dollar acceptable to a wide variety of parties? Yes. Does the US dollar become the thing that's on the price tag, right? Or the thing that my wage is listed in? Yeah, typically prices are listed in dollars and my wage is measured in dollars. Does it store its value over time pretty well? Yes. My dollar loses about 2% in value per year because of inflation. So that's not too bad. Now, what about the standard of deferred payment? Is this what my mortgage or other kind of loans are usually put into, like for payment over time? Yeah, typically in dollars. The Bitcoin doesn't fulfill any of these conditions. I don't know, again, of very many merchants that accept Bitcoin. So it fails the medium of exchange, which is the most important one. Unit of account, not very many prices are listed in Bitcoin. Stored value over time, that's really bad, right? So if it, can go as low as, one of my friends was telling me, I think that it was as low as like $8,000, like in March of 2020, and that today it's like, what, over $75,000? Well, it's not really storing value well, right? The value is fluctuating quite a bit. And, is it what we're going to list long dated loans in? No, not really. So again, money, dollars, yes. Crypto's not as much. Now again, you can be a strong believer in crypto. It doesn't dismiss you from believing in it, and even buying some, because you think that there is a future at some point where this could be used. But you'd have to really hope that it becomes, that money takes on these kinds of things. Because if it doesn't, then the prospect of, what's the value in crypto starts to go away. And so that first characteristic, that money serves as a medium of exchange, we said that that was the most important. And so to be this medium of exchange, that first function, it has to do these 5 things. Again, usable by most people, be standardized, durable, valuable, and divisible. If you think about our printed US dollars and the coins that go with it, it does all these things. And then we do things like fight counterfeits, replace broken, destroyed currency. It's even law in the United States that if most of your, let's say you've got currency that got burned and you've got at least 51% of it, you can take it to any Federal Reserve Bank and they will piece it together for you and put it back together. If they can put it back together, they will give you a new piece, right? That all serves to reinforce dollars as a medium of exchange. At one time, we do have some where it's like we have these, like, I think we had like a $10,000 bill, I think. But for the most part, and we used to have a $500 bill, which we use quite a bit. But now, for the most part, the $100 bill, US dollar bill, is the biggest thing. And it's actually the most commonly held. Most of you $100 bills are actually held abroad, outside the US, which says something about how it really is the worldwide currency. I don't think it still exists. But there was a better, if we were running an illegal business, there was a 500 euro note. And that was actually more valuable than it actually still exists. But it hasn't been issued since April 27th, 2019. No. But you can continue to use it, but they're not making more of them. Darn it. Well, it'll be harder to do our illegal business. It does make me wonder, though. Largest, yes, there's the 100. Yeah, but I actually want the value. Yes, there's the $100 trillion Zimbabwe dollar note. I'll look this up in my own time. Yeah, so we want to see here. Yeah, $100 bill looks to be still the good thing to go with. Yeah. In 2009, they showed that 336 $10,000 bills are still out there. 342 $5,000 bills, 165,000 $1,000 bills. I've actually seen a $1,000 bill. I don't know. And then there's one $100,000 bill. It looks like Singapore has a $10,000 bill, but yeah, pretty much. And Canada used to have a $1,000 bill. And we had the $500 euro, but yeah, pretty much the $100 bill. It's kind of sad. It's going to be pretty difficult to do our illegal business here with $100 bills. But anyway, yeah. So commodity money is pretty simple to understand. Commodity money, again, was one of the first kinds of money we had. Gold, silver. You could think of things having a universal value like animal pelts. And then there's a really famous example that, like in prisoner of war camps during World War II, that cigarettes became the currency because that would be something that people could hold. In prisons today, where people can't even smoke, the things that are become money are postage stamps and what do you call it? Cell phone minutes, like time cards, right? Like cell phone usage cards, which makes sense, right? Because they would have a pretty stable value. You can divide it, right? You could say I have 100 minutes on this, burner phone account card, and I'll trade you this for 3 minutes of it, right? Or postage stamps have a pretty stable value. You can't really rip them up into pieces, but you can imagine if you had an entire book of stamps, you could kind of break it up into something more. Commodity money, the problem, we don't have any gold or silver-based currencies anymore. None. And the reason why we don't, and we did in the United States, up until June 5th, 1933, we had a gold standard in the United States. Why do I remember that date? Well, at least the June 5th part is my birthday. We've got Adam Smith born on my birthday. John Maynard Keynes, the noted macroeconomist we're going to learn about here shortly, and U.S. goes off the gold standard, 1933. And so think about that right there. Think about, we're obviously in the Great Depression, but just think about how traumatic that would be. Is that the thing that gave dollars value, the fact that you could always turn it in for gold, that on June 6, 1933, that was no longer the case. That's pretty amazing, I think. Pretty significant about how big the economy had changed because of that. And then the other part to this would be that, starting in the 1700s, but then yes, I see it says the beginning of China, 10th century, but yes, and the Chinese did invent paper money, so if you've got a lot of pride for China, you could say that, yes, they invented fireworks, paper money, and a bunch of other things. But for the most part, they start to get used much more so in the 18th century, the 1700s in England and whatnot. And the transition was that paper money, instead of actually carrying gold around, you would carry a piece of paper around that you could always turn in for the gold, right? So the United States from the time it was founded until June 5th, 1933, had gone through these alternating times where the money would count for silver, we'd have a silver standard, or we'd have a gold standard. In fact, the election of 1896 was based on the fact of whether we were going to have a gold standard or a silver standard. But at least by 1933, we had a gold standard in the United States, which meant that you were given money, that you had dollar bills, but that these dollar bills could always be turned in for, that they could always be turned in for gold at any bank upon demand. And the United States has had a history of having central banks. We had a first Bank of the U.S. It was just called, I think, Bank of the U.S. That was pushed by Alexander Hamilton. Then we had a second Bank of the U.S. And that was, so the first Bank of the U.S. ran at the time it could have ran out, and then they didn't renew it. Then we got the second Bank of the U.S. that ran out in the 1830s, I think, and then Andrew Jackson didn't renew that, and then we had nothing until a really bad recession in 1908, 1909. It was so bad that the richest person in the United States, James Pierpont Morgan, had to bail out the United States. The recession was so bad that the entire country ran out of money, and the richest man had to bail us out. And Theodore Roosevelt, who was president at the time, he was concerned about it enough that he didn't like rich people in general. He was the one that was against monopolies and trusts and other kinds of rich people stuff. That he didn't like how vulnerable we were to a rich person's whims, and so he asked for the creation of the Federal Reserve, which we finally got in 1913, 1914. And what the Federal Reserve, the central bank, does is it manages the fiat currency that we have. Again, when the Federal Reserve was created, we still had a commodity-based currency, a gold standard, but now it is managing a fiat money. And so here we've got our definition then of fiat money, that it's any paper currency where the thing that gives it value is that it was authorized by the central bank as being the money. So that's the fiat part. Fiat just means law. So really the value of the dollar comes from when you look at the dollar and it says, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. That series of words right there is what gives money its value. Now, fiat money is both good and bad, I suppose, just like anything. Fiat money is useful in the sense, and the reason why we went off the gold standard in 1933, it happened because of the Depression, was that central banks, as we're going to learn here in later chapters, when an economy is in a recession or really bad off, it needs to create more money to get people to spend it. And central banks need that flexibility. And they wouldn't have that kind of flexibility if we had a gold standard, because then you can only have as much cash as you have gold. The problem of the fiat money is that, yes, you can expand it, reduce it, as central banks see fit. But the problem is that people have to believe that it's going to have value. As it says here in bold, that they have to have confidence that if they accept the dollars, that it will not lose much value. And this becomes incredibly important in the past 2 years, actually. So I'm 47 years old. I was born in 1977. And I was born at a time when inflation was really, really high. We're talking like 10% inflation. Pretty significant. My father, who's a veteran, you know, after the war in Vietnam, he comes back to the United States, buys a house, uses a VA loan, right, which is a pretty safe loan. And he told me that the interest rate he got on the VA loan, home mortgage, was something like 15%. It's crazy, right? For a VA loan, 15% mortgage. I mean, you look at that and you're like, geez, why'd you even buy a house? Inflation was really, really high. And say what you will about politics and who's good and who's bad or whatever, but the idea is that Jimmy Carter, who was the president at the time, wasn't reelected because of how high inflation was. And at least here, as I'm making this lecture in November, about a week after the election here in 2024, I mean, some people say that Biden didn't get reelected. People could have lots of reasons, but that one of the reasons was for the high inflation we had this past 2 years. And I'll say to you that outside of the very beginnings of my life where there was inflation, we had almost no measurably high inflation until 2021. And then it was quite significant. And it lasted for quite a while. And some would say, myself included, that people were, I don't know, confused or unwilling to admit that inflation had come back and, didn't do anything to stop it. And the problem that creates is that inflation causes people to stop accepting that money. Now, it's not going to happen yet for the US dollar, but we could look at other countries like in Zimbabwe, which had incredibly high inflation, that they don't use the Zimbabwean dollar anymore. They use the US dollar equivalent. Okay, I'm going to skip this. Okay, so when we look at how we're going to measure then the amount of money that we have, we're going to use what typically is called M1 and M2. M1 is a rather narrow definition of how much money we have. It's basically how many dollars do we have out there, the currency in circulation, as well as the amounts that we have in checking accounts and savings accounts. Then what we can look at as well is M2, which is everything in M1 plus small CDs and non-institutional money market fund shares. So sometimes if you look at your bank allows you to either have your money in savings, which means it's the actual money, or you allow the bank to invest it in like bonds and other really safe assets. That's what a money market is called. And so we can think of this all together in this kind of triangle where we have M1 and then M2 would be everything in the triangle. So M1 will always be smaller than M2. Now, to find out how much there is, fortunately, this is pretty easy. We can go on the Federal Reserve Economic Database website and look at that. Even if we look at trending search terms, which say quite a bit about us, we could just click on M2. Now look at this. When you're trying to think of how cool this class is, look at this. You now understand most of these trending search terms. In fact, you should understand all of them. This is the last one. And that's quite an accomplishment. There we go. Let's look at how much we got. There we go. Now look at this. Just look at this chart. This is measuring how much money we have out there. When we want to understand what is the cause of inflation, This is me talking, and there could be differences of opinion. But when I look at this, what I see as the cause of inflation is the fact that we increased the money supply by almost 50%, from about 15 trillion to about 22 trillion. I don't know why people are so surprised that we had inflation when you increase how much money is out there by 50%, meaning that if there's more money out there, the money that's out there is less valuable. And then have we really made any progress? I mean, we haven't really reduced it that much. And if we look at this over a longer time perspective, look at that. That's problematic. Any way you look at it, that is problematic. The only examples we get, right, of where things adjusted that significantly would be like here, 2008 crisis, maybe a little bit. Here, this would be the dot-com bubble. But really didn't do anything. It just kind of steadily grew. Again, you get this little bump in the 2008-2009 financial crisis when we're trying to get out of that mess. But what's interesting about this is that in 2008-2009 crisis, again, around the time many of you were born, the analysis of the situation afterwards, people say like the things failed, that we didn't recover more quickly from the 2008-2009 crisis because we didn't do enough. So we just didn't increase the money supply enough to fix the problem. And so that was the solution to COVID, was we did a lot. And we did. Look how small that recession is caused by COVID. Incredibly short, about 2 months. But the only way, right, the trade-off to having such a short recession is that you've got a lot of inflation. And so this is what you see right here. I don't really need to say much more about this. I've already kind of said most of this. 75%, well, it's kind of, I didn't see that. 75% of U.S. paper currency is $100 bills. You know how many $100 bills I own? None. I think my wife has a few from Red Money packets, but that's about it. Yeah. Typically, when we're talking about the money supply, most of the time we're going to be talking about things in terms of M2. Most of the time. And there's not a huge amount of difference between M1 and M2. So if we look at this, sorry, I didn't mean to jump that far ahead. If we go onto this graph, I'm going to add a line here. I'm going to add M1. What we can see is that there's not especially now, there's not a great deal of difference between the two. Yeah, the difference is growing a little bit, but M1 and M2 are both quite close to each other in value and move in the same direction. Okay. Debit cards essentially are just our checking account, which we already know is part of M1. Credit cards are not part of money. They are just a way that we, it's basically a loan from the credit card company, and we, in essence, pay it back, hopefully by the end of the month. But if you don't, right, you can pay it off over time. So credit cards are not money. Oh, God, I've already talked about all this. I'm not even going to... You can read that on your own. I've already done enough about Bitcoin and crypto in general. So banks in general do play a pretty important role in the economy. Essentially, the emergence of the banking system also comes during the Middle Ages. Again, when economies are starting to grow more significantly. And the way that banks make money is they make money by lending it out, taking in deposits, making a good approximation of how often people will be coming in for their money, and then lending out the rest of the money. So if we look at this from an accounting perspective and we create a standard balance sheet, this balance sheet would be one where the bank has certain reserves, money that it's sitting in its like bank vault and in its cash drawers, loans that it's made out, securities. This again would be typically U.S. government bonds. And then it owns its like bank branch and its computers and whatnot. You add everything up and you get your total assets that the bank has. And then we compare that to the liabilities and shareholders' equities. This is the other side of the balance sheet. So assets needs to equal liabilities and stockholder equity. So the largest, typically the largest liabilities would be things like the deposits, right? Because this is a liability. The bank owes it to the customers. And then, banks are allowed to borrow and whatnot from the Federal Reserve, from other banks and whatnot. So we add that up, right, and we get our total liabilities. And then the shareholder equity, stockholder equity is just what, for shareholders, what value they have in the bank structure. But we can see that the biggest liability overall still is the deposits. Okay, so now if it's gonna talk about each of these. I've already kind of talked about them just to kind of keep this relatively short. This slide is already dated, and that kind of is what we get to at the very end here. If we had had this class even 5 years ago, it was typically the case that banks had to hold about 10% of their deposits in reserves, meaning like in the bank vault at the Federal Reserve or something like that. Banks are no longer required to keep any reserves. They can lend out 100% of their money. Don't worry though, they don't. So this is a dated slide, but we're still kind of teaching it a little bit, just because I guess the professors who teach it are still old-fashioned, but myself included. But banks can keep reserves. They can keep some of the money and not lend it out. This no longer applies since COVID. Banks can now lend out all of the money they bring in as deposits. What a bank does that's important, that gives it value, is that it matches people who have too much money with people who need to borrow money. And if we match those two groups together, right, that's what a bank does, is it brings together those groups of people in a non-creepy fashion. Right? I needed to borrow money for my house. I didn't have to talk to some like gold chain wearing weirdo, right? I went to the bank and the bank made me a loan. And they funded that loan by the fact that, some old woman had a big old check, right? And she deposited it. And the bank, using economies of scale, meaning lending out to lots of different kinds of people, some people are going to pay back their loan, some people are not. And they're going to take all of that on a large scale to be able to balance things out. So banks have to deal with this information problem. Remember back to that Silicon Valley Bank? Silicon Valley Bank, one of the reasons why it prospered was because it did this relationship banking, meaning that the CEO would the CEO would, you know, put their money at the bank, right? Let's say the CEO of Roblox would put the Roblox's money at Silicon Valley Bank, and then, you know, Silicon Valley Bank would say, but, you know, I'll give you this really super sweet mortgage, you know, for your bank, if you do more banking with us, and if you hold your payroll accounts with us, we'll give you a sweeter deal. So they really like they brought together all of their kind of different banking relationships. And it allowed the bank to more quickly know how's the CEO doing, because they're the ones that are actually managing their mortgage and their personal savings account as well as the company's bank account. Okay, I'm going to skip this, apply the concept. So now let's look at the fact that of the role that banks play in creating money. So banks create money. If we look at this from a T account, meaning an asset and liability perspective, that if I put money in a bank, I deposit that money, it's a liability, and at the same time, the bank puts it in its bank vault, let's say in $1,000. So my assets equal my liabilities. All is good here in stage one. Then, if the bank, you know, it's not going to make money by just holding on to currency in the bank vault. It needs to lend it out. So what we get here, even though it's called the fractional reserve banking system, it's not really required. Right, banks could actually hold 100% of their reserves. It's just that it would be, you know, it'd be harder for the bank to make money as a business. But if the bank lends out money, right, it could lend out $900, right? And as it lends out $900, then what it does, right, is it issues a loan check to somebody, and with that loan check, right, it gets deposited, which now creates another deposit, right? So the bank lent out $900, and now someone else made another $900 deposit. And so if we keep following this process of banks lending out, let's say 90% of every dollar that they take in, so now 90% of that $900 is going to be lent out, which would mean now it's going to go up by $810, right? And so on and so forth. And we're going to see this expansion into deposits over time. And so that multiplier, that money multiplier, used to be pretty stable over time, but now it's pretty unpredictable. Which means that for the Federal Reserve, it has a little bit of a harder job. It really focuses almost entirely on controlling the interest rate, because what we're going to see here is because they can't really control the money supply through the banking system process, because banks are just doing unpredictable things with their money. So the question would be what does controlling the interest rate do? Like, how does that change the money supply? Sorry. Okay, I'm going to pause here the video in seconds. Okay, so I worked at the Federal Reserve Bank for about 3 years, 1999 to 2002. And so at that time, it was still what we would call a scarce reserve regime, where big banks would hold reserves not much more than was required. Banks would lend everything out that they could. Things changed with the financial crisis of 2008. I mean, that really was a transformational event in the U.S. economy that we're still kind of working through, to be honest. Some almost, 16 years later, we're still trying to work through that. And one of the biggest consequences that we see today is that we are in an ample reserve regime now where banks hold substantially more reserves. To give you an idea of how much more, well, we had some data that at least through Fred doesn't, they stopped the amount. It's discontinued. But look at this, right? So this is banks holding more than they're legally required to. Banks would hold almost nothing, right? And even by the time I left the Fed, next to nothing. And then look at that. Changes dramatically after the financial crisis. Again, so that gives you an idea of how banks are now operating. Banks are operating by holding lots of extra cash around, which can cause these pretty big changes in the economy. The Federal Reserve does pay interest on these reserve balances as well now. Not necessarily a good thing here. And I say why it's not a good thing is in part this number one here, is that we can see these fluctuations that as banks get into certain industries and whatnot, we may find that they, move quite significantly and draw down their reserves, and that could cause certain bubbles in certain sectors. As well, what that could mean is that that households might find that it's more difficult to get a loan, for instance, and so it might be harder for them to help the economy grow by simply just spending more money. So what we see here is that the money multiplier, the amount that fractional reserve banks create in the money supply, this is fluctuating quite a bit and has gotten significantly smaller, at least, since the 2008-2009 financial crisis. Now, in the United States, we have the Federal Reserve controlling the money supply. It is the bank of all banks. It also does things like stops bank runs. So for instance, when Silicon Valley Bank failed, one of the first few slides here, the Federal Reserve gets involved in that bank run and tries to manage it and stop a banking panic from happening. When Silicon Valley Bank failed, 2 or 3 other banks failed at the same time, and it was kind of the job of the Federal Reserve as well as the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, to stop a big panic. Because essentially, the banking system does rely on trust. So if I went around and I spread a bad rumor that a certain bank was failing, it may in fact fail if people started to believe my rumor. And so the central bank, again, is in charge of stopping bank panics. And it did essentially do this job well in 2008-2009 crisis, where it had to stop much of this feedback loop. And it had to give people renewed confidence in the banking system when everyone thought that it was collapsing. So again, 1914, we get the Federal Reserve. It didn't do very much until really after the Great Depression. Now, as the bullet point highlights here, many economists are critical of the Fed's decisions in the early 1930s. I'm not one of them. And the reason why I'm not is because we didn't know enough. I mean, most of the Keynesian theories that guide, or at least Keynesian-inspired macroeconomic theories that guide the Federal Reserve weren't invented until the late 1920s, early 1930s. So it's not like we knew something and didn't do it. We didn't even really know it. And so what we saw during the Great Depression is that banks were failing. The Federal Reserve did nothing. The Federal Reserve did not increase the money supply. And so even more banks failed and the economy suffered. And it really kept suffering until we entered World War II. If you want to learn more about all this, well, then you can take U.S. economic history with me at the Manoa campus. Today we have, as well, as part of the reason why we saw all the banks failing during the Great Depression, we had the establishment of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC. And what the FDIC does is it ensures that you will get back all of your deposits up to $250,000 if a bank fails. During that Silicon Valley Bank issue, right? Remember how I said Roblox had like 600 million some dollars? And it obviously exceeded the FDIC limit. Well, we made an exception. I guess it's good to be rich. They created an exception where there was no FDIC limit for those who were in FDIC in Silicon Valley Bank. Everyone got all their money. Here's the map. This was created in 1913. You can kind of see where activity was happening in the economy. The West Coast, we're here in our Hunger Games style. We're here in District 12, which covers West Coast, us, Alaska, and also the territories as well in the Pacific. I worked here in District 7 out of Chicago, but you can see, like, does Cleveland really need its own branch? I mean, at the time it did because there was a lot going on, but some people would suggest it doesn't need that anymore. These 12 districts are all run then by the Board of Governors, which is in Washington, D.C. And so this is kind of our mix of both regional representation as well as kind of central control that comes from the Board of Governors. And then the chair of the Board of Governors is probably the name that most people get to know. So in the past, it'd be like Janet Yellen, Alan Greenspan, or Ben Bernanke. But today we have Jay Powell. And within that Board of Governors, we have an incredibly important committee in that Board of Governors called the FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee. And what the FOMC does is it essentially determines the interest rate through its open market operations. So the FOMC has 12 people. It has all 7 members of the Board of Governors, always the district of the New York district, always that present because that's where the financial markets are generally located, and then rotating 4 presidents from the remaining 11 districts. And they determine how many bonds will be bought to create an interest rate target. So this monetary policy that they're doing, when we say that they're engaging in monetary policy, what we mean is that they're changing the money supply. Changing the money supply is going to lead to changes in interest rates. How? Well, we can just create for ourselves a very simple graph. Here's my quantity of money. Here's my interest rate, which is the price I pay for money. Here's my demand for money, meaning at high interest rates, I don't want to hold a lot of cash. And at very low interest rates, I have no problem holding a lot of cash, right? Because the interest rates are low, I wouldn't get a lot by saving it in the bank account and whatnot. But my money supply looks like this. It's vertical because it's determined by the Federal Reserve. But look at what happens if I decrease the money supply. It raises interest rates. And so what we see here, why should that matter? Because the amount of the money supply is in turn going to determine how much consumption we have, how much investment we have, and other kinds of economic activities. So these open market operations they tend to be the two here of the purchase and sale. So what we're saying here is that they buy and sell existing government securities, government bonds, essentially. So they buy and sell bonds, notes and bills, treasury bills. So they buy and sell U.S. government debt. If they buy it, then they're going to be paying, let's say that I own a bond right now in my investment account. It's a Tennessee Valley Authority bond. So the U.S. government back in the 1930s created a organization, an agency that provides power to the Tennessee Valley in the United States. And they issued bonds to pay for the dams and all the electrical system and all that and whatnot. So I own a bond. Now, if the Federal Reserve approached me and said, "Hey, Scheiding, do you want to sell that bond to me? I want to buy it from you." I'd be like, "Okay." And I give them the bond, and they give me, let's say, $10,000 for it. Well, that $10,000 is fictitious money that they created to pay me, right? And so that money came into existence. On the other hand, if you're hearing this lecture right now and you're saying, "Wow, there's bonds out there called TVA bonds. I want to go buy one." So you'd go to your broker and say, "I want to buy a TVA bond." And you'd be like, "Okay, let's see who's selling them." "Oh, hey, the Federal Reserve is selling one," right? So if the Federal Reserve sells one to me, then I'll pay for it, and the Federal Reserve will destroy the money that I paid them with for the bond. So I'd own the bond, but the Federal Reserve would now destroy the money. And that would be this is the primary way that the Federal Reserve changes the money supply, is by buying and selling U.S. government debt, of which there's a lot of. And so we can kind of see this description right here. And so I'm not going to go over these few slides here because I'm worried about how long this lecture is becoming here. But you can see this is essentially the description I just had here. Okay. For the most part, though, most economists don't believe that the M2 changing, at least in the short run, is having much of an effect on inflation and unemployment. But again, my description to you was that long run, as the M2 is increasing quite a bit, that does have an effect on inflation and unemployment. Kind of the description of what I said of, if you increase the money supply by 50% long term, it's certainly going to cause some measure of inflation and unemployment. Okay, the other thing that kind of bears mentioning here is that the Federal Reserve also, along with the state and the comptroller of the currency, also makes sure that we have a liquidity coverage ratio, which means that the bank is holding assets that are high enough quality to make sure that that systems are paying. We also have in the banking system moral hazard. And in moral hazard, the problem that was created, I think, still by the Silicon Valley Bank, is that if, I don't know, I think it was really dumb that Roblox put all their money in one bank. Not even a very well-known bank at that. I don't know. I mean, if I were the CEO of Roblox, I'd say I probably should fire my CFO. Why was he so dumb as to put it all in one bank? Right? Because theoretically, they should have lost all $600 million that was in their bank account, and they didn't. And so it creates a problem now future people think that the banks will be bailed, that customers will be bailed out if a bank fails, to avoid kind of this crisis from occurring. And so that's what we see here is that moral hazard is allowed to kind of continue to exist here. The reason why the Federal Reserve would justify it is they would say that it prevents any systemic risk to the system, that people would feel like they don't want to use banks if they were going to lose any money. But again, you control the systemic risk, but you still have this emergence of moral hazard. We've been spending most of our time, and most of the banks that you deal with are what we would call depository banks or commercial banks. But what we also see as well is that businesses are also involved in banking, like, in terms of like businesses, like, let's say, like Target having its own like debit card or whatnot. Well, they created a bank that's like Target National Bank to kind of run for those that have like the red card and whatnot. And also another important development is that banks tend to sell their loans, and so then they don't have a great deal of reason to really care who's borrowing their money because they might not be even holding on to their loan. That was kind of what happened in the 2008-2009 crisis, was that banks were making mortgages to anyone and they didn't care because they didn't think, they weren't going to be holding it long after. And so that's what you see with the secondary market of securitized loans, is that mortgages are now typically traded from one issuer to another in the securitization process. But again, what that means is that banks are more willing to make shitty loans because they know they might not hold it. And so you can kind of see this process here, the securitization process, as it occurs over time. This would be, what was that movie? What was that? It's gonna bother me until I think of it here. I'm looking it up now on my phone because it's about the only way I could. Sorry, I'm just not really. It's not coming to me here what it's called. Well, the one where you want to look at the securitization process would be an HBO movie that was called Too Big to Fail. The other one would be, if I don't, 1 second. The other one would be that you would watch, and I'm sure someone's like, yeah, The Big Short. That was the Big Short would talk about the securitization process as well. And then we get this shadow banking system as well, where we have non-bank financial firms, investment banks, hedge funds, money market mutual funds that are all kind of making themselves known in the financial system. And it creates some problems for the stability of the system over time. So here this is you get these two slides here where the 2008-2009 financial crisis gets only two slides here, but in essence, you really would have to watch The Big Short. You could watch that 2-hour movie. But essentially, the 2008-2009 financial crisis was a crisis caused by, for the most part, banks, by banks that made loans and didn't hold on to those loans, so they securitized them. That these banks were highly leveraged over time, and that as they were leveraged, they that once people stopped paying their mortgages and whatnot, it caused this cascading effect of losses throughout the economy, where then no one was then willing to lend out money. Federal Reserve basically pumped money into the economy, but some would argue not as much as they did during COVID. Then they really flooded the market with a great deal of money. The quantity theory of money is something that I still prescribe to for the most part. And what it does is it connects inflation to how much money exists. So I am a believer in the quantity theory of money. Not everyone agrees with me, so let's just let that be known here. But essentially what we would do is we would create an equation, the Fisher equation. And in the Fisher equation, we'd essentially say MV equals PQ, or here Hubbard and O'Brien, the authors of the textbook, make it just MVPY. And so we take the money supply, which is M, the velocity of money, which is a new term here, which essentially is saying how many times is that dollar, circulating throughout the economy over time. And if we took those two and multiplied them by together, we would get the nominal GDP, or the price level times the real GDP. So essentially what we would say is that nominal GDP essentially is equal to the amount of money we have times the velocity of money. Okay. So if that's the case, right, we could solve for things, right? We could solve for the velocity of money, right, by doing some simple division and solving for the unknown. But what we could also do is we could look at the growth rate of these different components and solve for a missing growth rate. And what we could see in that is that we have the growth rate of money supply plus the growth rate in velocity equaling the inflation rate, or the growth rate of the price level, plus the growth rate in the real output. Or that the inflation rate is equal to the growth rate of the money supply minus the growth rate in real output. So if the economy isn't growing a great deal, but the money supply is, then you would have a lot of inflation. And so that's where we get these kinds of key conclusions here about where inflation comes from. Velocity isn't constant from year to year, but it doesn't change a great deal. And so what we do generally see here is that you need to control the money supply with the growth in the real GDP, and you need to compare the two with each other. You need to basically grow the money supply enough to support a bigger economy, and then theoretically you would need to slow down the money supply when the economy slows down. That's the hard one, because if the economy is slowing down, you generally don't want people so pissed off. So you'd want to increase the money supply, which is what causes your inflationary problems. But in general, the data does suggest, I'm not crossing it out, I'm trying to circle it here, that there is this positive relationship, that you see more inflation in countries that grow their money supply too quickly. right? So that's the 1970s, the time I was born. It'll be interesting to see where the 2020s kind of end up here. But you can see that for most of your lifetime, the 2010s, the 2000s, 1990s, you're seeing rather low money growth rates and rather low inflations for the most part. I guess none of you are 1990s except me, this old man. And so if you look at this then across countries, is that countries that have no control over their monetary growth rate experience the highest inflation. And that a country like the United States that's done a rather good job of controlling its money growth rate has kept rather low inflation. And we got the famous examples of countries that don't do this well, and we get this hyperinflation, and the examples would be Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and pre-World War II Germany. So even if you look at the Wikipedia entry for hyperinflation, for instance, you'll see pictures of pre-World War II Germany, I imagine. Okay, 1 second here. Okay, and then, and so we get these examples here of how much soda costs that in Zimbabwe, over time, and you can go on eBay and you can buy these like really large valued Zimbabwean things like this $100 billion note or whatever. And here this woman looks like she's using Deutschmarks, and she's burning them in her stove. Again, this is a pretty complicated historical event. I could talk a really long time about it, but this lecture has gotten incredibly long. Okay.